I'm giving them 1 minute if they want to be late.
Okay. Thank you for indulging me like that.
You bet.
Well, considering I just showed up 4 minutes ago.
You're not late, Jeff. You were 2 minutes on time. 2 minutes.
I know. Well, I wanted to be here early, of course.
All right. Shall we start?
Sure.
Let's do
All
it.
right. Welcome everyone to the IFLA News Media section, lecture number 5, welcoming Kathryn Harrison, speaking about deep fakes. Today's session is moderated by Jeffrey Knapp from Pennsylvania State University. This event is being recorded. You will be able to see the recording on the News Media section's Publications and Conferences page. Your microphone has been muted for this event, but if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them either in the chat box or in the Q&A box. The panelists can all see them, and we will ensure that your questions are answered. And I turn this over to Ann Okerson, who is the chair of the IFLA News Media section. Ann?
Yes. Thank you, Anka. Sorry. Thank you, Anna. See, I'm already mixed up, but it's very early in the morning where I am. So as Anna said, my name is Ann Okerson, chairing the IFLA News Media Committee. I also want to give special thanks to Anna Kramer, who has managed all of our lecture series so far, and also to Anke Winsman from Germany, who's handled our publicity for this event, and Jeffrey Knapp, who's going to be the moderator. This is a team effort, and it is our pleasure to welcome this very global audience to our very special talk on the topic of deep fakes. So as you saw from our promotion, deep fakes are a hot topic in the media today. But what exactly are they, and why do IFLA members need to be concerned with this emerging technology? As you probably know, deep fakes are manipulated audiovisual content created by machine learning algorithms. A person in an existing image can be replaced with another's likeness, and that likeness can be made to say or do things that person never did. Sometimes these things are done in fun, but I think more often they're not. The tools to create and disseminate this new form of manipulated media are easier, faster, cheaper, and more accessible than ever. Kathryn has told us that convincing deepfakes can be produced in under 24 hours for less than $1,000, and those are very sophisticated ones. The challenge now is not just to raise awareness, but also to propose and develop effective responses. What do we do? The session is going to provide an overview of the technology and its implications, and it's going to analyze why this problem is so difficult to solve. Finally, Kathryn will address the policy, technology, and education solutions required to address malicious deepfakes. She's going to do this all in a very short amount of time, leaving time for questions and answers. We're enormously privileged to have Kathryn as our speaker today. She's founder and CEO of the Deep Trust Alliance, a non-for-profit global coalition of stakeholders building solutions and ecosystems to tackle deepfakes and misinformation. Immediately prior to founding the Deep Trust Alliance, Kathryn spent nearly a decade at IBM as a director. And we encourage you to read more about her education, experience, and accomplishments on the Deep Trust website. She's a frequent speaker on topics related to identity, cybersecurity, deepfakes, and blockchain. And in her free time, which I'm not sure how she can have any, she enjoys ultramarathons, theater, and mentoring women in technology. So it is our immense pleasure. Kathryn, welcome, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. The pleasure is all mine. So thank you all for making time to join us today. I am really looking forward to this conversation with Jeff. We are going to talk through the main areas and concerns around deepfakes. Just give me 1 second while I go ahead and share my screen. 1 second, please. Sorry, 2 seconds. My computer is, as ever, a little bit slow, but maybe I should let Jeff introduce himself as well while I'm pulling this up. My apologies.
Sure, no problem at all. Hello, everyone. My name's Jeff Knapp. I'm at Penn State University in Pennsylvania of the United States. I'll be just kind of monitoring the chat, and as Kathryn walks through this, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll make sure that we get them covered as we go through. But yes, I'm sure Kathryn has experienced something that we all experience at some point in time.
Fantastic. All right. So can you see this? Hopefully you can't see it, I bet you can see my notes. Hold on 1 second. One more time.
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can see the.
Sure. Third time is the charm, I promise. Let's see. All right. Okay.
There we go. Perfect.
Perfect. So today we're going to walk through the basics of deepfake technology. I am thrilled to be here. I know we've got people that are all over the world. We're going to start with a fairly short presentation, and I think that this will give you a good wake up no matter where you are. So let me ask you a question. What would you do if when you woke up this morning or as you were going to bed, a picture like this one showed up in your Facebook or Instagram feed, and the woman pictured was your mother, your daughter, your wife? How would you react? What would you do? What steps would you take? How would you know if it were real? Well, first of all, this is a real photo that was purchased directly from Shutterstock, so I can assure you that this is not a deep fake. But this is the type of content that can start to create really significant challenges for people, women in particular, but we're going to get into that, and really is the crux of the problem. So let's start with some really basic definitions. Anne did a really great job of laying out the problem space, but as all of you know, words have so much meaning, and it's really critical that we think about this with a clear set of terms. I see so much confusion. So we want to talk about misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So there are two key criteria. One is the question of falseness. So to what extent is information incorrect? So on one hand, you have false information, which is what we call misinformation. So very often people pass along news, source material that is wrong, but it's an error. It's not necessarily malicious, but it is incorrect. And we call that misinformation. So that means, your sort of classic error or misattribution, etc. On the other hand, we have the intent to harm. So now what we have, this is probably less frequently known, but something called malinformation. This is when you take true and real information, but it is shared or spread in an effort to harm or discredit the person about whom you are releasing this information. Doxing is a great example, sharing true address information, personal details, etc. At the intersection of these two areas is disinformation. So disinformation is both false with a very clear intent to harm or to mislead, and that is critical. So deep fakes can fall in a variety of different categories, but most often in that disinformation, because there is clearly false and untrue information, and so often there can be an intent to harm. So we're talking about deep fakes today, but the other set of definitions that I think are really, really important is what I call deep fakes versus cheap fakes. So deep fakes are the sexy AI phenomenon that has emerged since 2018. But deep fakes refer very specifically to video, audio, text that is created using machine learning algorithms. And we'll talk about that. Today, it is still a relatively small portion of the overall disinformation and misinformation that you find in the ecosystem. But as you can imagine, it's incredibly sexy and exciting to think that my face can be face swapped onto almost any video. And it starts to really enter a whole piece of the imagination about how do we know what's real. So we're very often finding deep fakes being used to refer to a whole range of different types of audiovisual manipulation that are actually far outside what is created with machine learning algorithms. I have an example here of Obama and Jordan Peele. This is a phenomenal PSA, public service announcement that was created in 2018. Famously, it has Obama call Trump something that he probably would never say in public. And it's a great example of how this can be done. Now, on the other hand, we have cheap fakes. Cheap fakes represent probably 96% of all of the audiovisual manipulation that we're seeing today. And this is all of the traditional manipulation techniques, whether it be miscontextualization, speeding things up, slowing them down, editing them so that they appear out of context, etc. Cheap fakes are very often, this is the very famous video of Nancy Pelosi, which was slowed down in order to make her appear as though she was drunk. So all of these types of audiovisual manipulation are problematic and have significant issues. But it is important to understand that difference because it has a lot to do with how they're created and where they are coming from. Candidly, in the 2020 election, there were a few deep fakes, and we can talk about that. But you didn't need AI-generated audiovisual material to convince people of things that were incorrect or untrue. So, and what's particularly interesting is that for most of human history, because it was so difficult and expensive to create audiovisual content, credible movies, video, audio of humans, you basically could trust what you were seeing unless you walked into a movie theater and you knew that you were there to be kind of hoodwinked and to look at belief, with some of the, with the caveat that state actors have been very involved in misinformation and disinformation since, candidly, the beginning of time, but certainly since World War II quite extensively. So I just want to spend just one more minute on how deepfake technology works. I am not the research scientist, but I think it's really interesting just to understand the concept. So you start with a body of training data. These are images and videos of real people, real scenarios that were taken. That is what you are training against. And then you have two algorithms. You have one that's called a generator. The generator is generating new pictures and trying to create from scratch images that look like the real original training data. Now, the second algorithm is called the discriminator. Once the generator creates a new, we'll use images for this example, image, the discriminator will compare the original training data set to the generated data set. And then the discriminator will say, I can tell this is real or this is fake. And every time it does that, it's feeding that information back to the generator so that the generator is getting better and better at creating those images. Now, originally, this was extremely expensive, required a ton of technical knowledge and know-how, as well as significant time to run all of those processes comparing the two. As everything in technology, it has gotten far faster, far cheaper, and far easier. So you have a deep fake when the discriminator gets to the point where it can't tell the difference between the generated data and the original training data. And that is, there are a few different technologies to do this. Generative adversarial networks is the main and sort of most famous term. You often will hear what are called GANs referred to, although there are other technologies like convolutional neural networks and otherwise. So let's talk about why do people use this and how do they do it? So the first and probably the most important harm that deep fakes do is what we call the liar's dividend. The fact that this technology exists in the first place means that anyone can shed very significant doubt on the provenance and the reality of audiovisual content. So this is a picture of President Bongo of Gabon. This is his New Year's Eve address from 2018. Now, President Bongo had been very ill and out of the country seeking treatment, they believe for a stroke in Saudi Arabia. And so he released this video trying to, give his message for the nation and to kind of reestablish his health and his position. Well, the opposition claimed that this was a deep fake video and attempted to stage a coup. A panel of over a dozen of the world's leading research scientists, including one of our advisors, Sui Liu, has reviewed this video, its original content, and there's absolutely no indication that it was made, certainly not with generative adversarial networks, and even less with Photoshop and other tools. So here you have a real piece of content that can be used by an adversary to try and discredit the reality of what is being said. So you don't even have to have a deep fake for the technology and the harm that is there to have an impact. And I think we've already seen this in numerous political environments across the world, but I think this is one of the most important problems that we're going to need to face. And I think I would imagine this community in particular hears this all the time. I don't believe it. I don't know how it's real. Prove it to me. Oop. Sorry, can you still see my screen? Yes. Oop, hold on. That's an embedded video. So the second problem that we've seen is around market manipulation. So this happened in 2013. The Syrian opposition infiltrated the Associated Press's Twitter account. They were aiming to sow political chaos and discord, trying to really freak people out that Obama had been hurt based on explosions in the White House. What's fascinating is that the actual impact happened in the stock market. So there are very sensitive algorithmic trades which can detect moves in market sentiment at very small degrees, and they have a whole set of automated trades. So you saw the S&P 500 just absolutely crater. It lost about, I think, 26% of its value in just a few minutes. Over time, the White House, I think within a couple of hours, the White House was able to, actually it was 30 minutes, the White House was able to say, no, this is clearly a hoax. It's not true. There were no bombs. Obama's fine. There's nothing here. And the market basically went back to where it was before. But as you think about how do you undermine credibility of individuals, of companies, of people, of governments, all you need to do is get a small percentage of the social media landscape to suddenly start to follow, retweet, or push this out for people to begin to think that this is true. So, you know, this was, you have to think back to, I think it was Casino Royale, the first David Craig Bond movie. And that starts with a terrorist who makes his money by blowing up airplanes. Well, now you don't have to blow up the airplane. All you have to do is convince Twitter that someone did. So the other key, and most frequent example that we're starting to see is social engineering. So deep fakes can be used to impersonate someone, to steal their money, take access, have them say or do things that they've never said. There are a few recent examples where a CEO, a German CEO of an energy company, called up his bank and asked for a transfer of $250,000 to a bank account in Bulgaria. He got through all of the bank's security protocols and procedures, and the money was wired and it disappeared into the ecosystem. The only reason that they found out that this was a fraudulent transaction is the thieves got greedy and called back and tried to get more money transferred out. And their private banker thought to himself, this is not the usual behavior of my client. He called his client on his cell phone, and the CEO said, no, I haven't authorized any transactions. You had the criminals on the other hand. So this is going to be increasingly used to impersonate everyone from politicians to business executives to journalists. And it's going to be something where our privacy and how we identify ourselves is going to be really critical. We're going to need to pay very close attention. The final major set of harms that we see today is extortion and harassment. So this is another form of social engineering. The woman in this picture is Rana Ayub. She's a fairly well-known journalist in India. She has been very critical of Modi and the Hindu Nationalist Party. And several years ago, a deep fake porn of her was released. It was shared very widely on social media channels and networks like WhatsApp. And obviously, sharing deepfake porn of anyone is a terrible and traumatic experience, but she was faced with death threats, attacks. She had people outside her door. She went to the police to try and get protection and help to get this taken down, to get people to stop. They watched it with her and laughed and said that she deserved to have this treatment. Ultimately, it took UN intervention to get some of the major social media platforms to take this video down, but it still can be found in different dark places on the internet. Now, what happens when you're not a world-renowned journalist and you don't have the UN to intercede on your behalf? We've recently seen a whole spate of TikTok stars under the age of 18 who have been used in these types of videos. So this is a problem not just at the largest geopolitical level, but also for individuals. And it's really critical that we understand and think about that. So those are some of the key harms that we'll see. Deep Trust Alliance is very focused on the problem of deepfake pornography because today it accounts for about 96% of the deepfake videos. Today, a lot of those targets are actresses, movie stars, famous people, simply because their images are very widespread and there is a feeling of accessibility and access to them. This really started in 2019 when a Reddit user called Deep Nude offered an open source application to make it very easy and quick to create these types of deepfake pornographies. The first ones weren't great, but as you can imagine, this code has spread widely and many different developers are able to use it. And I think we'll probably get into that as we go into question and answer and think about the solutions. How do you solve this when the Pandora's box is sort of already quite wide open? So we've obviously talked a lot about some of the political candidates that have been targeted, and in an increasingly polarized world, it becomes, as you start to get these media bubbles where people only see information that they themselves believe or sort of are attuned to, it becomes very complicated to prove what is true and what is not true. And I think we're already seeing that in democracies with very, very strong institutions like the United States and Western Europe. We have heard directly from journalists, particularly in emerging markets, that challenge of the liar's dividend applies to them as well, as very often authoritarian governments will use deep fake laws and policies to try and silence the opposition and accuse that when they are trying to report, whether it be crimes, misdoings, etc., to try and silence those stakeholders. So there are a whole host of concerns as we chatted about on the political side. We've talked through some of the financial crimes. Let's talk a little bit about what can be done, because this could be an extremely doom and gloom way to start or end your day. And I think it's really important to think through some of these pieces. So from a technology perspective, there are a few key approaches that are currently being taken. The first is around provenance. So understanding where is the content coming from. Today, most internet users really have to rely on the website or the source that they're getting their information from. And let's be honest, websites like NewYorkTimes.com, Washington Post, etc., can all be spoofed quite easily. So providing an ability to verify where did the actual images come from, literally from the device level, so that you can't quite see my phone, but so that you can see exactly what camera took the pictures, when and where they were taken. Not necessarily that all of that information needs to be public and readily available to everyone, because that could certainly put human rights activists into significant danger, but being able to show that it is indeed verified. There are quite a number of blockchain-based approaches which are being used, although any of these approaches ultimately rely on the humans that are using these technologies and verifying the information. So the first are the provenance-based approaches. It's not only about the content that goes into images, video, audio, etc., but it's also about the algorithms themselves. I talked about deepfake nude. That became an open source app available to anyone. And there are many places in GitHub and otherwise where you can find open source code for creating deepfakes. Now, on one hand, I am a huge proponent of open source innovation. It makes it much easier for many people to be able to share code, to learn, to iterate. Sunshine is most often the best disinfectant. However, you can also take that code and use it for a whole host of nefarious purposes and in ways that are less than ideal for individuals, organizations, and society. So I think there's a real opportunity to watermark both the images that are used in training these algorithms, as well as the algorithms themselves, to be able to identify where is this coming from. Now, obviously, you have a bit of an adversarial game, which we can start to talk about. On the other side, you have detection algorithms. So DARPA, which is the innovation arm of the Department of Defense in the US, has now sponsored 2 multi-year programs, the first one called Media Forensics, the second called Semantic Forensics, which are really targeted towards identifying algorithms and tools to detect and stop deepfakes and other types of manipulations. There's also been some interesting news out of I think it was the Army just this last week, about some new technology that has evolved, and there are a handful of companies which are building deepfake detection algorithms. So those are important and going to be a critical part of the ecosystem. However, there are limitations to how they can detect deepfakes because there are thousands of ways to create these deepfakes, and often even once the algorithm is finished, you'll polish them with human editing to fix light, to fix any semantic issues. So these deepfake detection engines are constantly trying to catch up to the best and the newest deepfake creation algorithms. So technology is an important set of tools, but it is not, unfortunately, the silver bullet. The second piece is around policy. So, I have a picture of the US Capitol, but it's not just about government policy. As I indicated before, governments are very much a double-edged sword in this space. They can be used both to protect and harm freedom of speech and reporting of potentially difficult information in these ecosystems. So you also need to see corporate policies. As we know, most of the information that gets shared is actually going through the private pipelines of Facebook and Instagram, Google, and other social networks. Now, most of these companies have fairly strong deepfake policies already, but their disinformation and misinformation policies are far less consistently enforced. So individual companies that are far outside the realm of media and the internet are suddenly going to be faced with having to create policies as they find fake users in their platforms, whether it be setting up bank accounts, trying to manipulate their services. They're also going to start to see attacks against their employees. I could upload a fake video of Jeff and put him in a very compromising position. And so there's going to need to be exactly policies and processes for tackling and dealing with this set of challenges, both at the government level as well as at corporations and individual organizations. It's not simply a question of making laws. In the United States, there are 5 states which have created deepfake laws. In Texas, most of those deepfake laws were used to try and get attack ads taken down by various opponents in the last election. So far, we have yet to see the case law as to how these policies are actually going to be implemented. in countries like China, Malaysia, Myanmar, and others, deepfake laws have been used really systematically to silence opposition. So not simple and very nuanced as ever. And then education. So obviously this community understands how important media literacy is, not simply for children, but actually across the spectrum. We find that people over the age of 65 are 7 times more likely to share disinformation than any other category. And as we see these new ways of creating social connection and communication, especially in a pandemic era where we now live 95% of our lives in the digital world, understanding not only how to read and interpret information, but when and when not to share is just so critical. Because candidly, social media platforms have made it too easy to share this information. And while disinformation has existed since the beginning of time, I mean, the first photograph of Abraham Lincoln is photoshopped in 19th century parlance, and there's misinformation, I think, on the Rosetta Stone. The reach and the velocity at which that information can reach the masses is unparalleled. And so there really needs to be a core set of norms and policies and ethics that govern how individuals behave around this, because otherwise we're going to continue to be in a very difficult and challenging environment. Candidly, I often say, if you would not stand in the middle of your town and shout this to all of your friends and family, then you probably shouldn't share it on Facebook. And just that moment of pause to provide circuit breakers and those types of things is just really critical. And obviously near and dear to my heart with Deep Trust Alliance is that you need a coalition of different stakeholders. This is ultimately the technology itself. While it is simply a tool and an enabler of human behavior. And so we need to make sure that we are bringing together all of the different actors that have an ability to influence information consumers, technology companies, governments, nonprofits, et cetera, to solve this set of problems. So I have a bit more, but I'm going to pause there. There've been some great questions in the chat, and I think maybe it makes sense at this point to move to more of the discussion portion of things. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Thank you very much, Kathryn. Yeah, it is fascinating stuff. I see, yes, Stephanie Bean has this question. Any examples of deep fakes that have fooled GANs or cognitive computer experts, computer networks, rather?
Great question. So in terms of deep fakes that have fooled some of the detection algorithms, that's actually quite common. Facebook, which has very strong policies against deepfake, has deployed some deepfake detection algorithms, but there are constantly deepfakes that are found and reported. Because it's very nuanced, deepfake detection algorithms are built to detect certain styles of GAN. There are all sorts of GANs with fun names like StarGAN and AutoGAN and a whole host of others. And the deepfake detection algorithms, almost like a radio, are tuned to hear certain frequencies. And if your deepfake creation algorithm is honed away from that, then they will miss that. The other thing that's really interesting to notice, people are often asking me, oh, well, how do I know if it's a deepfake? I know that if I just don't see any blinking, that's the signal. That will show me. But this is an adversarial game, as I've said a few times. So with early deepfakes, that was a great way to be able to tell if the humans just sort of sat there with zombie eyes. But once that was recognized as an issue, the research scientists that were creating these algorithms fixed it. they realized that blinking had to be part of any information that was created, and that was no longer a tell. Some of the other tells that I often suggest people look for are the coloring in the back of people's mouths or other sort of crevices in their face or their body that often just become purely black when they are being deep faked, but would have some level of shadow or nuance. So far, I think the most important, the most valuable way of indicating, of showing deep fakes, if you're looking purely with your eyes, no other information or indicators, is to look for semantic challenges. So a woman whose earrings don't match, clothes that don't match, you know, things like that, hairstyles that don't seem to be consistent. Now, I have nothing to say about people's hairstyles, but those are the types of things that are much harder for deepfake generation algorithms to create because they really vary and are, you know, very contextual. But this is one of those things where it is unfortunately only getting easier to create credible deepfakes and only getting harder to find them. However, one kind of positive piece of news is that, I don't know if anyone saw the Tom Cruise deepfake, that took days to put together, a ton of editing and a very specific actor who was already a Tom Cruise lookalike and was used in those specific areas. So it's not yet in the kind of palm of your hands. You can do it in seconds, but Zoom is using some of this technology. I'm in a low bandwidth space and that helps my video look clear. You can do it on Snapchat, and there's a whole host of apps like MyHeritage and others that are making this readily available.
Right. Okay, and then one attendee has posted about mentioning provenance and, you know, where these things come from and how you might advise, you know, the everyday person, since that's many times who librarians are working with, you know, the everyday person verifying images and videos that are shared.
Yeah, so there are a few things. Number one is credibility around news sources and really understanding what are you looking at, where does it come from, and what are their standards or ethics? What is their funding model? So often, especially in the US, we've seen kind of niche publications that are funded by very strong and very specific interests. So understanding where the content is coming from and where it's funded from is important to be a critical reader. The second is to look for corroboration. So obviously, every journalist in the world is trying to get the scoop and get the story out first. But if you only see one report, if you only see it through one type of publication or the same article published and published over again on non-credible websites, that should be a massive red flag. The third thing is around what is the emotional response that this content is trying to get from you. This is probably more applicable to news headlines than images, though images are innately emotional. If it is very incendiary, if it gets a very strong reaction out of you right away, that should be a red flag. What is the creator of this content trying to get me to do? And then take another look at all of those pieces, because that is really important. A very simple reverse image search can quickly and easily show you where else this might have shown up. There's some pretty well-known photos of a Catalan separatist group that are not from Catalonia at all, that were taken years before. And a simple internet search would start to bring that. The problem is that most of us, I don't know about you, but I'm scrolling my Twitter feed before I drink my coffee in the morning. The time to take that effort to really do that kind of research is really challenging. And I think I saw a comment. One of the things that Deep Trust Alliance is working on is sort of the good housekeeping seal of approval. And if you can verify where the content comes from, what are the integrity standards, and you can have a a red, yellow, green type of indicator, that can be huge. There are already tools like NewsGuard, which was founded by the previous, I think, editors of the Wall Street Journal, which is doing this for advertisers. And I believe you can actually download their browser plugin to help you evaluate specific websites and what are their journalistic standards, what do they require. The most important thing that I tell everyone, and I've already said it, but I'll say it again, is if you're not sure, then don't share it. You might not want to do all of that research to figure out if it's real or if it's not. And if that's the case, then that's fine, but just don't put it back out into the world. There's no need to kind of put fan the flames.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of great points there. Yeah, and then we have Boris talking about whether you think the prohibition to some video apps like Face Swap and things like that, creating deep fakes videos from famous movies. I think we're missing a verb there, but it's like, does that make media literacy necessary? Do you think that's I would imagine so.
I think it makes it all the more necessary.
Absolutely.
You need to critically understand what you're seeing, where it comes from, how to interpret it, and then what to do with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, the free press is a critical component of democracies. And obviously it plays a different role in countries and nations that aren't democratic, but that is so important, especially as we're now bombarded by so many different sources and ways in which we get that news, and we have less time and attention span to actually evaluate it. And I think, there was, I just have to tell this story because I think it really illustrates the problem. Last year, I woke up, it was probably April, it was it must have been May. It was during the Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, D.C., drinking my coffee, and I'm scrolling through my Twitter feed, and I see all of these posts that the internet had been basically shut down in Washington, D.C. for overnight so that there was the city. And I thought to myself, that's nuts. There's no way that happened. But maybe, I don't tend to follow any crazy, I really am very focused on very moderate and trusted sources in all of my social media feeds. So I said to my husband, who's reading the Washington Post, I'm like, do you see any reports in there about Washington internet going down or phone communication or anything? And he's like, no, I don't see it here. And then I'm like, okay, check the New York Times. No, okay, must be a scam. But I had about 30 seconds in which I thought, did that really happen? And I spend all day and all night working on disinformation.
Right.
So if it can happen to me, who has a very carefully curated feed, it can happen to anyone. Right.
Right. And I know too, considering deep fake video, especially from famous movies and things like that, part of media literacy, of course, is also understanding the rights, and copyright and things like that, and how, some of this stuff can also play into that.
Well, what's kind of sad, but also really interesting, is that some of the most effective ways to get deep fake porn in particular taken down is copyright infringement.
Sure.
So if you don't have rights from the source video to use it, then that is far more often what can be used to get content to be removed than the harm that the content is creating.
Right. Since there's already a legal infrastructure and lots of money at stake that will take care of that, rather than just a private citizen complaining.
Exactly.
Yeah, another great question. As a parent myself, my kids are often fooled by things because they don't know about the real world yet. They don't know when a thing is implausible. Does Kathryn have any comments about this issue? Implausibility. I know myself as a librarian that this is something I try to get to them. And I, as much as I think tools and plugins and things like that can be great, I always say the best defense against, misinformation is at least staying on top of the news, and understanding when, wait, that doesn't fit with what I just read over here about something else. So
that is such a great question, I have to say, because there are implausible things that happen every day. And I love that aspect of the world, and that we get to, with the internet, hear and learn about implausible things that are happening everywhere.
Sure.
So I would take that opportunity with your kids to try doing some research. Okay, you heard this thing. What about it sounds real to you? What sounds maybe a little bit suspect or surprising? Okay, great. Now, where did the source come from? Was it your 4th grade best friend who heard it from his big sister? Or was it something you saw on the news? And I think that that's obviously something that we have to do, not just for children, but for people at all ages as technology advances and as the world changes. So I don't know that I have a complete answer to that, but sure. I think kind of those rules of thumb that I've shared are probably a good way to tackle that as well.
Right. Yeah, that's great. We also have, how do you change the definition of right to protect people from deep fakes and help them to classified creation and so I think we're talking, are we talking about rights? I know I saw some questions about privacy rights in there and whether that, how that can play into it, especially because of course the US has very different privacy laws than in many countries.
Well, so this is one place where I think Europe will actually be far ahead of the United States because of their priority around privacy protections and privacy rights. Now, the one thing I will say is that this is a double-edged sword. We actually just had an announcement last week out of the European Commission. Some of the privacy laws would have made it very difficult to stop child pornography and grooming, which is a very, very serious set of crimes against children. Mm-hmm. So we have to really, so I think that what's really important is, number one, to understand how nuanced these issues are. Second, to figure out where is the biggest harm. And I think some of the privacy rules and regimes will certainly be able to help protect or at least provide an enforcement framework for people whose images or likeness are being used in inappropriate or harmful ways. They could also shield the creators of some of this content. And so I saw, I think, some comments from Stephanie about, won't the technology always be so far ahead of the policy? And I completely agree with that.
Right.
There is no way in which, it takes human society hundreds of years in certain cases to try and catch up with major technology developments like the printing press and things like that. And as the pace of technology accelerates, we can barely wrap around our heads about what is today versus what will be tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So what's really critical is to regulate the behavior and the harms, and to evaluate and understand how much more harmful, and that's maybe not the most elegant way of saying it, but the persistence of this content in the internet age. And in the old world, the newspaper, it did eventually, get thrown away. And while the information stayed over a short period of time, long term, the content wasn't readily or easily available unless you were going into archives, et cetera. Right. Today, almost anyone can find nearly anything that's ever been published on the internet with a little bit of work. So I think where governments in particular that are writing laws and making policies about this, they really, really have to think about, number one, human rights, and using that as a foundation, particularly in the democracies for whom human rights are kind of a cornerstone of how their societies are built, and then really focus on the intention and the behavior and then the harm and impact. If you write the laws and the policies around those aspects, you're going to be far more successful than if you're trying to regulate any particular algorithm or technology itself.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, oh, go ahead.
No, I just saw Stephanie's last comment about wouldn't that
sure.
need to be an international law? Oh, the world in the age of the internet. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. What's fascinating is what different regimes we have country by country, even across the democratic republics in Western Europe and North America. What in the United States kind of freedom of speech is a right that is almost, is sacred. In other countries, you don't have the right to use anti-Semitic language, to share things about Nazis, etc. in Germany because of their history. And so there are going to need to be, this is why I think corporations and multinational organizations actually play such an important role, because they span jurisdictional and geographical boundaries that no country can. And certainly the United States can try and regulate content that comes from servers and hosts in the United States within the boundaries of Section 230, which I won't go too far into. But I can just as easily see content that's published from China or Russia or elsewhere as anywhere else. So this is where we, for decades, we were able to rely on a fairly centralized media ecosystem, which had many drawbacks. And I think that it's great in a lot of ways that there are many more voices that are able to be heard, but it puts a lot more onus on the individual information consumer. And I hope that we'll see the proliferation of new approaches to media ecosystems. So just to be very specific, today, we all get to read all our information for free, mostly funded by advertisements. But there are emerging ecosystems where great content gets kind of upvoted and rewarded, and bad or inaccurate content gets penalized, and the creators of that end up having to pay penalties. So there are all sorts of different approaches that I think we will see experimentation and work ongoing, and that we should be sure to think about.
Yeah, exactly. And I know we just have a few minutes left, but I see Matilda had posted a question, which I plan to mention myself. But do you think there's any way of helping to counter this phenomenon? Particularly librarians. Many of us as librarians not only deal with the public in helping them find resources, but some of us also teach in classrooms to talk about, searching for valid information and things like that. Are there any recommendations or things like that that you might be able to offer?
Absolutely. You guys are really the front line for finding information and understanding how to evaluate and consume that information. And so I think certainly anytime there's an opportunity for education, whether it's informally as you're helping someone with a specific inquiry or much more in a classroom setting, explaining what the technology is, what the harms are, and some of the basic things that can be done. That's critical. Secondly, pushing for standards around credibility for different journals, newspapers, and to understand the difference in standards across different, certainly national publications and other approaches is another really critical opportunity that I think librarians can participate in. There's a whole effort called the Credible Web Initiative under W3C, which is sort of the consortium that, hate to say runs the internet, but helps to guide the development of the internet. And a lot of the standards of credibility and integrity that you, I'm sure, work with can be used and applied and really should be brought to the broader conversation. I think, unfortunately, today, too often, the technology executives live in a very siloed technology world, and they don't understand those other pieces. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do with Deep Trust Alliance, is bring those stakeholders together. And I think librarians are a critical asset. I see Kate has mentioned programs like Checkology.
Mhm.
There are a whole host of apps and programs by some really incredible organizations that can help you to evaluate and understand and teach the people that you're working with how to figure out what's real and what's not. Much in the way that we've all had to understand, like, is this email spam? Are they trying to steal my credit card details?
Mhm.
That now is coming out of our inbox and into the social
Right.
media world. It's been there for several years, but I think the pace has just increased. We certainly saw that with COVID and others. And so that's what we'll need to do.
Absolutely. Okay. So, Stephanie, mentioned about the W3C organization. What was that again? How is that? How is that spelled? Is it three or no? Is it Roman numerals? I didn't know if that's right. WC. Yeah. W3C.
W3C.
Right.
I'd be happy to share the link to the working group. I mean, it's gone through different periods of activity and dormancy. But I think, the Credible Web Initiative. Thanks, Rachel.
Right.
I appreciate that. That is, the facilitator is fantastic. But what's really interesting is to make a lot of progress, you ultimately, in any of these open source initiatives, you often need kind of corporate sponsors and stakeholders that are doing some of the development and helping to push this forward.
Mhm.
So that's another really interesting dynamic in the open source ecosystem. You don't want any single entity, company, or government or otherwise to control what's real or what's not. But when you have all these stakeholders, getting them to move forward and getting them to agree is not always straightforward either.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're a little bit over time. Maybe we just have a minute. I see Anna Bone has talking about media literacy. What programs, courses, etc. would you recommend? What should these programs teach? How to detect deep fakes and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to share with this group. We actually have a whole set of resources in terms of partner organizations that help with these types of programs. There's the National Media Literacy Association. There are, of course, all of them are escaping my head, but literally I can picture the list that we have. So I'd be happy to send that and we can share that as a follow-up. Checkology, which was mentioned, is fantastic. There are quite a number depending on the set of stakeholders. For journalists, and I find this great even for non-journalists, there is an organization called First Draft, based on the concept of, journalism is the first draft of history. And they have an incredible set of tools and resources, all available for free, with training, et cetera. And while it's aimed at journalists, I think it would be very relevant to this community as well. There's another great organization called Witness, which is focused on human rights activists and helping them to have a platform to share what they are finding. Similarly, there are tools there that I think would be very useful.
Okay, so it looks like we are out of time. But I just want to say, before Anne joins us again, just wanted to thank you again, Kathryn. This has just been fantastic and has been a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your information with us and your organization, and we really appreciate it. It's been a real help.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you, Jeff. What a great conversation.
Yes. Oh, Anne, I think
you're
you're
on
muted.
Yeah, I have to dismute myself. I think it falls to me to thank everyone for joining us, but particularly to Kathryn for everything you've shared with us.
Absolutely.
And I think, Jeffrey, Anna, Anka, News Media Committee, we need to talk a little bit more about how to work again with Kathryn on some of these issues, because you're not just a one-time visitor for us. We want to see more of you and engage with you. I think IFLA is a good forum for that. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Kathryn, and we'll meet again soon.
Indeed.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.